everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. My name is Cassietta Treywick. I go by Cassie. I'm one of the admission counselors here at the City of Sky Weatherhead School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine at Tulane University. And today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Rustin Reed. I'm going to give it about 2 minutes to let everybody else join. But again, thank you all so much for tuning in today. All right, the time is now 12:02. Again, thank you all so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Again, my name is Cassietta Treywick. I go by Cassie. I'm one of the admission counselors here at the City of Sky Weatherhead School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And today I'm introducing Dr. Rustin Reed as he presents his Public Health Discovery Seminar Series on rubber Re-Vulcanization, a case study for health. And so if you have any questions and you may have to step out before the seminar is over, please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A chat or in the chat as well. And so, Dr. Reed, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cassie. Can you hear me okay? All right, cool. Awesome. So, as Cassie mentioned, we're going to talk about rubber revulcanization. I was mentioning to her that maybe I should have called it recycling because that's not a term that you hear every day, but it's one of those things where I'm sure you've seen that sometimes it's used as a meme, sometimes it's used just as an abbreviation. IYKYK. If you know, you know. So it's one of those things where if you know about revulcanization or vulcanization, then you know, but no one else does. So it's very interesting to me though. And if you don't know that much about rubber and the process for making and recycling rubber, you're going to learn a little bit about that today. So this is a I call this a case study for health. This is what I call a case study, but it's an exposure assessment that I performed many years ago. Actually, I guess it was 10 years ago. It was in 2016. So uh, it's been a hot minute since it happened, but I think I still find this interesting and I hope you do too. So we're going to cover our objectives, go over some background information, and an introduction to the case. We'll talk about methods and results. Both of those will be fairly quickly. To be honest, the front end of the this session will be more heavily loaded in terms of the background and introduction. I want to make sure that you learn a little bit about rubber today, and then we'll talk about results and a little bit of a discussion about some of the so what. So we did this and what of it? Why are we even interested in this? We'll try and answer some of those questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. At the end of the session, you should be able to summarize two challenges associated with rubber recycling, explain two aspects of the rubber revulcanization process, and describe two potential environmental health benefits to a feasible, effective rubber revulcanization process. So you can see a little bit where we're going with those objectives. So, so it, to be honest, I don't remember exactly when the use of rubber really skyrocketed globally, but it was in the 1800s. It was mid 1800s. It's the Industrial Revolution. We've Someone realizes, hey, there's this material that it's almost like magic. Rubber is almost like magic. it is an amazing material. If you think about the types of stresses we put on rubber, it has to maintain its shape, but at the same time be flexible. Two two difficult requirements for a material, and yet rubber is able to pull it off. So originally we used natural rubber, excuse me. It's latex and it's from trees. So there are certain types of trees that grow. I forget the name of the trees. I would call it a rubber tree, but I forget the species. But they live in tropical areas, and so during that time, the initial ramp up of the Industrial Revolution, countries like Brazil and then parts of regions of the world like Southeast Asia, where these trees grow well, really they came into a boon because of the economic growth surrounding rubber. The problem with natural rubber, however, is that it is soft, sticky. When it heats up, it becomes weak, and when it's cold, it becomes brittle. If you think about what we use rubber for, not necessarily great, not necessarily great characteristics of this material that we want to say put on airplane tires. So when an airplane is heavy, it's coming in at high speeds. When you land, I'm sure you've watched the planes come in while you wait at the airport. You see that puff of smoke. It undergoes a lot of stress. It's coming from 30,000 feet in elevation, 35,000 feet, where it's very cold. Those tires get very cold, come down to maybe to sea level or wherever we're at, much lower elevation or altitude, and put it under a lot of stress when we land, and those tires heat up. So it's got to be able to go from very cold to very hot and vice versa quickly, and do the things I mentioned, magic things. Be strong and resilient, but at the same time be flexible. So rubber, I want to say latex, but natural rubber didn't quite fit the bill when it comes to some of these applications. So in almost 1840, Charles Goodyear, I'm sure you've heard of Goodyear tires, but discovered the vulcanization process. So by adding sulfur, mixing in sulfur with the rubber and heating it up, he found that you can create these molecular chains. So it really gave rubber the strength and resilience that the natural rubber was lacking. And you could think of it sort of like so one analogy that I came across that I kind of like is a bowl of spaghetti. If you think of bowl of spaghetti and all the noodles are loose and kind of sticky and stuff, what vulcanization did was it um it links the noodles together in a sort of net. So think of lining out your spaghetti noodles in a net, sort of, like a lattice structure, and with a little bit of connection there. So not super strong, but it gave some structure enough that it would hold its shape and be more resilient to all the sorts of extreme environments we use rubber in. So we're going to dive into some of this process, but not all of it. Basically, though, the main idea here with this is that we are chemically treating the rubber by adding sulfur, by heating it up. There's some other things that happen, but again, that's how we vulcanize it. Is those are the two main things: is adding the sulfur and heating it up. And there's more to the process. We're not going to discuss all of it. When it comes to re-vulcanization, typically, how that's done is through what we call devulcanization. When we say vulcanize, you could think of it as sulfurize. We're adding sulfur to the rubber, and that's what helps make those chains and a sort of net effect if we were thinking of spaghetti noodles. So to revulcanize first, we have to take those chains that were present in the original rubber and break them apart. So we devulcanize and then re-vulcanize to try and get those chains back together so we can have a nice strong rubber. The problem is, the problem is that we're not very good at it. Even today, our technology for recycling rubber leaves quite a bit to be wanted. We have a lot of progress to make in that regard, and so a lot of rubber is wasted, or we try to create new uses for that rubber. So we're really more reusing rubber. We don't recycle very much of our rubber. There is a lot that of rubber waste that's generated every year across the globe. So you can see billions of tires that are discarded every year. And so there are millions of tons of rubber waste that we generate. Now, we mostly reuse. So you can see the numbers down here. Most of it we shred up into pieces and we make what's called crumb rubber, or it can be sort of pelletized. You see that at playgrounds, for example. So we haven't reshaped the rubber back into the original product with its original qualities and strength. It's not quite as good as the original product, but for a playground, we don't need something that can as high a quality as, say, an airplane tire. There is some that is revulcanized, but it's not very much. It's less than 10%, maybe up to 10% of rubber globally is revulcanized. One there may be some different reasons for that. I'm not familiar with all of them, but one is the feasibility. So it does cost money. It's a process, and it takes effort and money to recycle that to get it close to its original strength and elasticity. Again, rubber is amazing. Another problem is, like I mentioned, our technology is kind of lacking. If we revulcanize rubber, the tensile strength is it can get up to about 90% of the original rubber material in terms of that strength, but more often than not, we're not that close. We might be more like 75%. You also get it becomes more brittle. It's more likely to break. It's not quite as resistant to abrasions, etc. And so it doesn't work as good. It's not as good when we recycle rubber. It's not as good as when we first create it and manufacture it. And so often, there's kind of a wall of text on the right there, but the idea there is that most of the time, rather than completely using a 100% recycled rubber, we combine it with new rubber that we've made so that it will actually meet specifications that we need. And so there's a huge opportunity there for us, someone who's smarter than me to and more creative to develop a process where we can achieve complete recycling, meaning 100% strength, and in a way that's feasible, so that more and more of our tires could be recycled rather than being shredded and put in playgrounds or in asphalt. There are lots of things that we do with it that are still good uses, but it would be great if we could recycle it completely. So this was a startup company at that time. I'm not sure. I haven't kept up with the company. I'm not sure where they're at today, but 10 years ago, it was a startup with what the company claims. I'm not going to evaluate their claims at all, because I don't know. I'm not qualified to do that. But they claim to have a revulcanization process that was much more efficient and effective than traditional recycling processes for rubber, up to 90 to 100% of that the original strength, etc., essentially returning it to new rubber through that recycling process. So this is quite a claim. And again, I don't know. I don't know if they've actually achieved that. I haven't kept up with them, but very interesting. I was hopeful that, hey, this is an interesting company that is doing something good that we need. So I hope they're successful. So if you're familiar with organizations and businesses and companies, those startup that startup phase can be very challenging. It's you don't have a lot of resources, you're trying to make things work, and you have a lot of competition, so you're often competing with very large and established companies who have a lot more resources than you do. So it can be challenging. So this company had a complaint from one of their workers about their exposures. irritation, so eye irritation, upper respiratory system irritation, and they requested an exposure assessment. And I happened to be connected to the company that got the request, and so they asked if I could help out, and I said sure. So they provided me some information about their process. They provide me their the recipe for not every detail, but basically the ingredient list for their process, so that I could take a look at potential exposures. And the thing is, anytime you have a chemical reaction, it's very difficult to predict what products you may get out of that reaction. So it's also heated, so that changes things as well. You can get a lot of reaction, a lot of different possible exposures, health exposures to these workers. So that makes it a challenge, but I had to pick something. I can't measure everything when I go out there. Unfortunately, we don't have those tools available. Not, that's another thing. Our technology is not quite to that point. So so had to make a selection of a few things that might be likely culprits. And I had decided to focus on a few things. So Stoddard solvent, acrolein, and formaldehyde. And you've probably, I'll bet just about everyone's heard of formaldehyde. The other two are a little bit less well known, but we'll talk about those briefly here. So Stoddard solvent, again, not as commonly known as formaldehyde, but it has some of the health effects that are consistent with the complaint. So irritation, not only of eye, but also skin and dermatitis. It can affect the central nervous system. So it has a few more serious health effects, but not as likely to occur as something like irritation. And you can see the exposure limits there. The point I want to make with sharing those exposure limits is to compare the exposure limits of these three gases and vapors. So this one is in the hundreds, so it's pretty high exposure limit. I do want to make a quick point that that's another thing that limits us is when trying to decide what to do. Let's say, put yourself in my position 10 years ago. What am I going to measure when I go try to assess exposures here? It's nice to have something that does have exposure limits that we know about. There are plenty of things produced in the process that we haven't studied. There's no literature on it. There's no research, no exposure limits. And so we maybe there might be a way to measure it, but what are we supposed to do with the number that we get if we don't have a limit, right? If we don't know about the health effects, what can we do? So you're limited in that way. So that does narrow the options. This was the first one. Acrolein is very irritating. So that's one thing that jumps out about acrolein. It's a very strong irritant. Again, eyes, upper respiratory system. And if you take a look at those exposure limits, the first ones were in the hundreds of parts per million. These are they're just 1/10 of a part per million. One thing I want to say about the ceiling limit is the previous limits were over an 8-hour day. So you shouldn't be exposed to more than 100 or 500 parts per million over an entire day. Ceiling means that it should never reach that level. You should always keep acrolein levels below zero point 0.1 parts per million or 100 parts per billion if you want to measure it that way. So the idea here is that based on data, these levels have been set much more stringently, much more conservatively compared to Stoddard solvent. So acrolein is something nasty that you wouldn't want to come in contact with. And then formaldehyde also something that we don't want to come into contact with. Again, it is an irritant. It does affect the eyes, nose, throat, consistent with the complaints from workers. You can see there that the exposure limits were similar to acrolein, except here this is for an 8-hour day. So very serious, but based on the exposure levels, maybe not quite as much of a risk as compared to acrolein. Both still uh, very hazardous. Formaldehyde is a known human carcinogen, so that's bad, right? We know that's bad. So those are three things I was concerned about and decided to measure on this assessment. So we're gonna there's a lot going on here. Like I said, this is a startup, so they didn't have a huge facility or anything. They had a small warehouse with their process set up, and they were still, like I said, kind of figuring things out as they were doing this. Um, so I like to draw, so I'm gonna draw a little bit here. I don't have my stylus, so my screen might wobble here a little bit, but so a couple of key inputs here. First, there's there's a hopper that the workers would dump their activator into. So it would come down into this thing, and it would get mixed up. There was also a powder that they would add here. So the you have they would blend up rubber pieces and then mix it with a powder here. It would come down into this heater, and then it would get cooled. This activator would be mixed with it, and then there's also a catalyst added in there. Anyway, lots of moving parts and things going on. Eventually, so my drawing here is I went the wrong way there, but anyway, so it all gets mixed in here, and then the rubber, the final product gets dumped out into 55-gallon drums, and that's the final product. So interesting process. Again, I'm not a rubber expert, revulcanization expert, but I had to learn. That's one thing I like about my field is learning about different processes. How it's made. If you've seen that show on YouTube or Netflix or whatever, I can watch that show for days. If I had time, I would binge that show and watch every single episode. I really enjoy learning about processes and how things are made. And so while I was sampling, so I got to the site and met with the management and met with the workers. And then while my samples were running and I was collecting data, I was talking with the workers and trying to figure out how this all worked. And it took about a day. It took me about a day for me to really wrap my head around what exactly was going on and the process. And a little, well, I'll talk about the recommendations I made in just a moment, but there's real value in talking with the people who deal with the problem every day. And in this case, that was the workers who were actually making it happen, making the magic happen. And I gained a lot of insight by talking with them. So they were stuck with me. I was their shadow for the day. There were several workers, so I wasn't stuck to one person all day, but I had the opportunity to hang out and to talk with them, to pick their brains and see what maybe we could do to improve the situation. Anyway, so an interesting process. Again, similar to before, the main idea is we take the rubber, the old rubber, we shred it up in the blender into little pieces. We're going to mix it with a catalyst and some other chemicals, heat it up, mix it together, and then we cool it and we get our final product. So, I'm not gonna read through that, but the main idea here is that there was one of the part of the catalyst was this stuff called a rosin. It was one of the chemicals that was added into the process, and it was usually because of the humidity, it was sort of cake together, stick together, and harden. And so the workers would have to break that up into a powder. It needs to be a fine powder to go into the process. So that was part of the work. They're exposed to the dusts from this process, so they're grinding it out. Excuse me, grinding it up, crushing it up. This is it's like cooking or chemistry on an industrial scale, right? I said, the ingredients. There's a recipe. It's a recipe that they're following. It's an industrial scale cooking operation or chemistry operation. Anyway, they have to get this powder. ground down, and then so that they can include it in the process. They had to weigh it as well, so they scoop it into these drums, and then they put those drums, or excuse me, they dump it into buckets and weigh it in the buckets before they put it into the apparatus there. I'm not going to read this. This is kind of for reference, but one part of the process involves, and I have that gentleman circled there, a worker dumping chemical into the activator. So that activator mixer is where all the ingredients come together. So if you were baking, that would be the oven. And so all the ingredients come together and get mixed up. And he was being exposed while they have to open it up. He dumps the stuff in. That was a big concern for me, that part of the process. Uh, after they were done filling up the buckets, they would move them onto pallets to get them ready to ship out. Um, anyway, that's just to give you an idea there. So I don't want to dive too much into too much detail here, but we use passive badges, so it's a much easier way of measuring. You just get these little clips. So I had three, one for each thing. I had more than three, but I mean, I had three different types. I had one for the solvent, one for formaldehyde, one for acrolein, and you just clip it on the worker's lapel or somewhere on their collar or something. That it's easy. That one's really easy. It's not always that easy. Anyway, so those are the methods that I used. And one thing I want to point out here is that everything was below the limit of detection. So got low results, low results. And but well, I'll highlight a couple things here and then we'll go to our next slide because I have a question for you. I'd like to hear from you. This is where it'll be a little bit more interactive, but measured everything and trying to do our best to help identify the cause of this employee's complaints, irritation. We don't want people to have to work and be irritated or worse while they're just trying to make a living, just trying to do their job. So we want to identify it, but we come back with nothing. So that's what this means right here is non-detect. Non-detect. Everything was below the instrument's ability to measure it. It was one way of thinking about that is it's so small the instrument can't see it. It may be there, but it's so small that it can't see it. And so that presents a dilemma. Again, put yourself in my shoes in this situation. What should we recommend? So I would like to hear from you in this situation. What do you do? First of all, what do you do? What do you tell the company or the employees? You did all this work and it all comes back as very low concentrations, which in a way is good. At the same time, we didn't identify a source. So what do you do? What do you say? What would you recommend?
Please feel free to drop your answers in the chat or in the Q&A chat.
So while you think, thanks, Cassie. It's a tough question, and I don't necessarily have all the right answers myself. So obviously someone is being exposed to something if they're having complaints. If it's causing enough irritation for them to bring it up to their employer, then there's a problem. At the same time, we did our assessment and we we did not, there was no smoking gun. There was no smoking gun to say this is the problem, and okay, that's easy, we can do this thing to fix it. There wasn't that. And so we know something is causing that irritation. We don't know what though. And so we're going to try and take some steps to just make sure that we protect people generally. We don't have, again, the smoking gun, but we can do some things to make sure that we protect people. Now, one thing that we can say is, well, so there's something called there are ways that we can sort of get a snapshot of what is in the air just to get an idea. It would be called a grab bag sample or a canister sample. And so we could do something like that. That's something we could recommend. We could recommend continuing to monitor it, monitoring for other things. So I picked those three things, but clearly, well, it looks like maybe I picked the wrong things. That may be the case. It may be that it wouldn't have mattered what I picked because the true source of the irritation was either doesn't have an exposure limit or we don't have a way of measuring it. There are some problems. Again, our technology, we have great technology at the same time. We have a lot of limitations still, not just when it comes to rubber revulcanization, but also when it comes to sampling a health exposure in the environment. We can't measure everything. We don't know how to. We haven't developed a method yet for it. So we have some limitations. And so I made some broad recommendations. I'm going to go back a couple of slides here, a few slides, but you can see this worker. So he did have a respirator. He was wearing a full face respirator. That's you don't often go to full face unless you're wanting to protect the eyes. So if you're getting eye irritation from something, then you can go full face. If not, you could do a half mask respirator. So you're protecting the nose and mouth. The idea is you're protecting your lungs and the respiratory system. If you go full face, then it tells me that they're thinking about eyes as well. They're trying to protect eyes as well. So that was they had that. They were using it. I don't know if that was in anticipation of me showing up or just or if they were already doing that. But that is not a bad option. But there are reasons that we don't want to just use PPE. There are limitations to that as well, meaning something like a respirator in this situation. But that's something that we could recommend is that they continue to use that. I'm going to go back, well, okay, just one. So it may be hard to see there, but that's the same worker. He's wearing a chemical resistant suit with gloves while he's dumping. So that tells me that they are thinking about the exposure there while that oven, basically, it's like an oven with a mixer in it. While that thing is open and he's pouring chemical in, they are thinking about that. And I think that's a good idea. I would recommend that, hey, continue to do that. But I was really concerned about this piece specifically. So I'm going to go forward. That process specifically and was thinking, well, opening the oven to pour stuff in with an open bucket is probably not the best way. There are probably other ways that we could do this. So a simple recommendation, and sometimes those recommendations are the best. And I guess I'm gonna take a moment to highlight my comment from before. A lot of the ideas that I got through this process were from talking with workers, the people who were actually doing it and maybe I had the idea or maybe they had the idea, but we'd bounce ideas off of each other and say, well, what can we do to make this better? Through those discussions, come up with some easy solutions. And I say easy, this idea here would cost uh so to either have a hose or nozzle coming out of the bucket, a closed bucket, or to have your oven enclosed with a hose that we just attach to the bucket so it's completely enclosed. It would cost $100 maybe, maybe $100. For this was a small company, but for even this company, $100 is not is that's easy. That's easy. They should be able to do something like that. So that was one takeaway for me that I felt was good. You can see down here, well, or maybe you can't, but there's a hose that comes out of the oven with our finished product as it goes into that 55-gallon drum. You can see that has a hose and that is enclosed, so you don't get anything escaping out of there. But it's in that process of adding into the oven where there's a problem. They had They had some other issues that I was concerned about in terms of ergonomics. So again, a startup where they're just trying to figure some things out. They don't have a good process. And so they had workers. This was it was still, it wasn't, well, I'd say very warm and maybe even hot to the touch, 55-gallon drum with the liquid product still in there that they were manually scooting around. And that's not probably a good idea. And so I suggested, hey, because they have a forklift already, hey, there are attachments for forklifts where you could just use the forklift to pick that thing up and move it over to the pallet. That would be pretty easy to do without exposing people in that process. So this is one of those cases where it's real world and it doesn't have necessarily have that satisfying tie it up in a bow ending. Not that I didn't hear back from them. I'm hoping that they were able to resolve the the exposures and the concerns and complaints and make sure that people weren't overexposed and they didn't have to they didn't have to be irritated or be uncomfortable while working. Anyway, interesting situation, but it's real world and it shows a couple of things that I want to highlight with it, and that is that one, sometimes that's how it goes. You do the work, you take the measurements, you do your assessment, and at the end of the day, you still don't have that answer, the answer for what's causing this, but you can still come up with the so what. So what are we going to do about this? And and there are a few steps that I recommend for them, including the bucket cover and the oven cover and just enclosing that process. Uh, but there are some other so what's from this as well. So one of the other so what's is the value of talking with the people who are exposed and deal with the health exposure every day. So they're gonna know it better than anyone. Better than management, better than me. They're gonna know that better than anyone, and they probably have some good ideas. It helps to talk with them and listen and see what they say. Now, some of the ideas won't be good, but some of them will, and so you really can get value from having those discussions. And then the last so what is going to zoom out here a little bit with rubber revulcanization in general. So there's a lot of waste that we produce, and there are different ways that we can manage that waste, including for rubber. That being said, we all can make a difference in our own individual behaviors when it comes to rubber waste. And then, I'm sure there are mountains of shredded rubber somewhere. There are. It doesn't just disappear if we throw a tire away or something. It doesn't just go away. Um, and I guess I would say, this is a group that ought to be involved in the process of creating something better. Now, I think it's probably mostly going to land with a chemical engineer, let's say. A chemical engineer is probably, or a team of them, are going to be the ones who really push the breakthrough. But that being said, so I'm speaking from an environmental health perspective, an industrial hygiene perspective, public health perspective, is people like us that we do want to make sure we have a seat at the table when those things are when those plans and processes are developed, we can make a huge difference if we can just have a seat at the table. We don't have to have, we don't have to be the chairperson or something on the committee, but just so that the public health perspective is heard, that environmental health, that worker health, that those perspectives are heard, that we have a voice, and we can make a difference. And I hope that companies like this one are successful. Like I said, I haven't followed up with them. I'm not sure where they're at. I've worked with other companies, alternative diesel fuel companies, for example, and I guess I was thinking more of them when it comes to the competition. These companies are competing against uh, very large companies, and it's hard. Anyway, and so those companies that there are these small startups that are trying to make a difference. Obviously, they need to make money, but at the same time, they're trying to make the world a better place. And I hope that we can, um, that we see more of that, and also that we can support that. And like I said, have a seat at that table when all of these sorts of things are happening and being planned out. That's all I have. I want to open up for questions. I normally have a problem of going too long and talking too much, but I left some extra time today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for that seminar. And please feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A chat or in the chat as well. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions for Dr. Reed, thank you all so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Please stay tuned for our next Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. I'm going to give back almost 15 minutes of your time. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Reed, and you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.